So I'm stoked to be here because I find myself sort of at a lot of conferences where people are talking about process. And I gotta say, like, my background is a developer and I'm pretty bored with discussions around process. I'm not down on it. I just feel like it's time for us to start talking about like the impact or the things we're producing supported by whatever process. So I started with this picture because I'm spending most of my time these days working with people trying to produce things, products, services, and trying to figure them out, trying to help them figure out how to, for instance, build less of the wrong thing faster. How do you figure out how wrong you are sooner? And I know that might sound like a negative connotation, but I would challenge all of us to kind of say, I think we're often more wrong than we know, and we don't really spend enough time kind of measuring that. This is a nonprofit from Minneapolis, so it's interesting working with nonprofits. My company, I've always done like about 10% of the revenue for nonprofits, the profit, I should say. And nonprofits in the States, you have to write a grant. In order to get money, you have to convince someone, you should give us X amount of dollars so we can do Y. And so when they walked in, they had 3 questions. How much will it cost to build it? How much will it cost to maintain it? And how will it cost to host it? The third one obviously being the easiest question. And the part of the question that I think is problematic is this singular nature of it. And it's really deep in a lot of people's minds. It's like, we have to get it done. And the bigger it is, the more ambiguous it is. So I thought I'd just walk through and kind of tell some of the stories around this and some other stories. Craig introduced me this morning, and he's right. I've always been sort of a nonconformist troublemaker. I cooked up this thing called non-bond, which I've always said was like the least amount of process with the most real and measurable value, and it's the leanest process ever. It's so lean it doesn't even have a website. Because I was like, at that time I was so sick of people arguing about Scrum versus Kanban, and all I could think of was that old like Reese's commercial of like, you got your chocolate in my peanut butter. Because having the best process has never been the most meaningful thing. Now, the first speaker this morning who I was like blown away by and totally inspired by, I thought it was funny that she said, if you're old enough, and I immediately dropped into the category of old enough. Because I cut my teeth working on the Z80s and like 8080s. I spoke at Intel one time and I met one of the people that designed like the 7070 series chips that I used to use quite a bit. But I was amazed how she talked about it in the context. I think that a lot of the programmers I know don't understand and, nan, nor, or, and not the way she sort of laid it out. I'm also, the second session I went to this morning sort of reminded me, we've done a lot at DevJam for like kids and girls in programming, and this is my daughter. So she was a little bit younger when I convinced her to write her first report at school and like when she was 12 years old on Java. So my daughter's up in front of the class like doing command line stuff, not because she wants to be a programmer, because she wants to write a Minecraft plugin. And I thought, that's what I thought the second speaker really did well, is she kind of made a context of like, how do you like engage kids in learning? And I think the same thing's true with adults. Like a lot of people always used to say to me when I started coaching, how do you make someone do blah, blah, blah? How do you make them do Scrum? And I always thought, you don't make anyone do anything. If you make them do it and they don't want to do it, as soon as you leave the room, they do whatever is comfortable, even if it's dysfunctional. You sort of have to understand what is someone's context. You know, how are you giving them something that's going to help them, or are you just telling them to do something new? And that probably comes because this doesn't look like me anymore. This is who I used to be. So it was pretty embarrassing. I was in like a pretty tragic, like big hair metal band of the 80s. And there was like 2 kinds of people. There was players and there was posers. And when you got up on one of these stages, you could either play or you couldn't. You couldn't broadcast everything you knew about some guitar or some form of music. You could either play or not. And when you suck, people walk out. And anybody that's ever experienced that, that's a humbling feeling. It's like, oh, well, they don't think we're very cool. Or it's like, no, it turns out you're really crappy. And then you play about a couple bad gigs, you have a couple bad auditions, and you figure out, I either got to practice more or I need to learn a different technique, but it's completely an iterative process. And I got to say, the next slide, it might feel like absolute pandering to you guys, and I wasn't going to put it in my presentation until I was sitting in the airport in Christchurch. And this guy's phone rings, and it's Problem Child by AC/DC. And I'm thinking like, like when I heard about Malcolm, I was kind of like, okay, this guy is an institution when I was this guy. And so I was going to say, let's have a moment of silence for Malcolm, but that doesn't seem appropriate, so instead we're going to have a moment of AC/DC together. Because there is nothing wrong with that, man. So I don't know how many people here are AC/DC fans, but like, if you've ever seen these guys play, a lot of people want to have rock stars on their project. And I always, when I hear that metaphor, I think, that's because you don't know any rock stars. Because they're usually pretty horrible people. When I was this guy, we had videos on MTV, so I met a lot of rock stars and stuff. And a lot of them were just self-centered jerks. Not Malcolm. You ever saw AC/DC? Dude would stand back at his amplifier and play, and then when it was his turn to sing, he'd walk up to the front, sing, and walk backwards. And you'd get that groove. Just rock solid music coming out. And I learned a lot in the music community. And like one of the people I love is Frank Zappa. And Zappa once recorded this album called Shut Up and Play Your Guitar. And I sort of feel like that's where we're at right now. Like, shut up and show me your product. I always feel like people are telling me how great their process is, and I think, man, I hope your customers aren't talking about how great your process is, because if they are, your product must really suck. You know, you don't go to the gig and kind of go, I wonder how Zappa's band practices. You go and you listen to them, and if they're bad, you're sort of let down pretty quick. And the last thing I wanted to kind of do as far as introducing myself is, I like Nassim Taleb. Did anybody read Anti-Fragile other than me? One of the things Taleb talks about in the book is this idea of subtractionist. And he talks about a lot of systems that are made anti-fragile. And his argument is that it's very comfortable for people to add more instead of take away. And certainly that's what I sort of seen over the last 18 years in this agile space, is that people just keep adding process and they feel better because they're doing the process. And it's harder when you're 60 people collectively trying to build one thing versus 6 to 8 people trying to build one thing. Process just seems to kind of grow uncomfortable, and it starts to become about, are we doing the process instead of are we having the impact we want? So impact to these people is significant. They came to us because we wrote an app for a group called the Youth Services Network in Minneapolis. It gets really cold in Minneapolis, so a lot of homeless youth have a smartphone, but they don't have a service plan. So they go hang out at a near coffee shop, and we wrote an app to help them find a place to sleep, because our governor is trying to outlaw homelessness in our state, which is pretty cool. And it was a classic thing of like, we were able to sit quickly with homeless youth, and we were pretty much wrong about some of the things we thought they needed. And we found it out really fast. And we did all sort of stuff that's agile-y. I always feel like when people sort of discover agile, the first place I worked that I programmed, we did a lot of stuff that was agile. Like we did pair programming, but we just called it working together. Because we worked on a lot of really hard stuff in C++, and it turns out when you show someone else your ideas, you've more quickly found some of the problems. Did anybody see Clara coding today? I mean, it was pretty cool. I could imagine a whole bunch of people in the room wanted to shout out her syntax error. Yeah. Right, yeah, but she sussed it out later, and I thought it was really neat. But like at one point, someone yelled out that challenge. I saw this guy, Stu Halloway, one time. He used to just put up open source code at this conference I spoke at called No Fluff, Just Stuff, and he called it mob programming. And he would just bring it up, and people would just start shouting out problems as he coded. And his point was like, if everybody in the room is dialoguing in some moderately disorganized fashion, he could move really fast, because he would just pull down an open source project, the vast majority of which didn't build. So he was able to suss that out really quick. And these people, they came in, they said, will you build us an app? Now they're not trying to build beds for homeless youth, but it's a really similar thing. They're trying to help kids in my city that are trying to find a career, find education that's offered free so they can get a career. And they really had a nice riff. They were like, we want this. Success for us means that these kids can fail gracefully. They can try a career and they can sort of try again. But they came to us and they said, we want you to build us an app. But that's not what they do. They provide a service for youth that they're trying to help get educations and build careers. And what we did is, that I'm going to talk about later, is we sort of just reset the discussion. Because they want to know how much it's going to cost, and they want an app, and they're really certain about all these things. And we used a lot of these techniques to move them out of that space. And that's sort of what I feel like I want to see more people do, is I'm not down on process. But if you use sort of that this or that language of the Agile Manifesto, I think it's time for us to say product first, process second. Just like when you go to see a really great group of musicians play, they've practiced. And they've practiced in sort of organized fashion, and if they're not in tune, even if you can't hear it, you know something's wrong. So you're happier when they're in tune. Even AC/DC is a very in-tune band. The Ramones, a little bit different, if you're a Ramones fan. So this is me producing music. And this is a band. So this guy's name is Fred. This is me right here. Fred, you can't see it, is actually pushing the keys on the piano right now. We had this song we were working on, and there was a space in the song, and we were trying to find just a sound to put in there. We all knew how to play guitar. A couple people knew how to play like a Hammond B3, so we had drummers and percussionists, but Fred and I went out and did stuff that was wrong. So we took the piano here, and you can see I'm strumming it. So it's the world's largest auto harp. And you probably wouldn't even recognize the sound, but it's completely wrong, but it's appropriate. And I think I used to work with these bands, and as the producer, I always thought my job is to help them be as good or better than when I meet them. But you walk into the studio, you got your 15 songs or whatever, and if you're working at an expensive place, there's a lot of pressure, just like there is a lot of time on projects. And you have to be ready to kind of say, this song's not working. And some of the ones you walk in with, you're absolutely sure this is our hit, this is going to be the money song. It just falls apart in front of you. I mean, it's totally like that no more cowbell thing. There's a lot of no more cowbell when you're the producer, and you have to be careful how you say it, because if you harm someone's pride or excitement, you know, it can really wound someone through like a whole session. Speaking of being wounded, I worked for Prince for a while. If you work in Minneapolis and you have any kind of tech geek chops, you end up stumbling out to Prince's studio, or you did when I was a working musician. He wasn't the nicest person I've met. But dude he excelled at being wrong. So he wasn't like a lot of people go into the studio and they're like, we got to get our music done. And it feels like a project. They got to get the project done. That's not how Prince worked. He would work on a song until it just wasn't working anymore. And then he would go to lunch and they'd put up another song and come back and work on it. He was trying to get the songs right as well as getting them done. Ward Cunningham once called that in the programming world a programming episode, which I thought was a really nice metaphor to sort of talk about programming. You start working for a while, you find your groove, and then it falls off, and if you don't let go, you end up going backwards. Everybody here has probably had that scenario where you're working, you think, I'm almost there. It goes past a time when you're supposed to be somewhere else, and someone calls and says, where are you? And you get in your car and you drive away, you drive for 5 minutes, and you figure it out, because you sort of stepped away from the problem space. And I started out with this stuff, first of all, because I like AC/DC. And second of all, because I wanted to sort of set some metaphors. I think what we're producing is, I love technology and it's significant, but what we're producing is things that help people. When people ask me how to define product, I always say, product is the thing you produce that impacts someone else. It could be a service, it could be infrastructure as a product, it could be an actual product, it could be all sorts of different things. Being a Scrum Master is not a product. That's some kind of a role, and maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. But I always feel like that's what I'm doing today. I like the metaphor of producing. I used to call myself a coach. I'm not sure what that means anymore, so I'm sort of running away from that word. When I started coaching, it was an XP coach, and it meant wading into with teams and kind of setting up continuous integration servers, telling people, yeah, we can do that. I know you don't think we can, but we can do that. It was helping people use test-driven as a design tool, not write a bunch of crappy tests, then write a bunch of crappy code and just collectively have more crappy code. It was trying to figure out, can I define what I'm doing in the form of something that's deterministic before I start doing it, so I write less of the wrong code as a metaphor. And today, this is one of the things I always ask people. How wrong was our last delivery? So just ask yourself that question. Delivery could mean a lot of different things. It could be a little micro delivery, it could be a story, it could be the output of an iteration, it could be a minor release, it could be a major release. How wrong was it? And the next question is, how do you measure that? Does anybody here measure wrongness at their company? You see these Scrum teams, and they say, we got 46 points done the last sprint. And I always ask them, how many points were wrong? And they sort of look at me like, what do you mean? I'm like, that's the problem. Is you just assume that because you got stuff done, you're successful. And getting stuff done is only one aspect of being successful. In fact, I think it's something that the Agile community has got people a little bit too amped up on is everything is not about learning from delivery. Learning has, I think, always been the kind of core thing that I've liked in these iterations. But sometimes you can learn from delivery. Sometimes the right dimension to it is not to deliver anything, is to figure out what you don't know outside of the production, outside of the code, if you will. My email signature for years and years has said, if you don't know where you're going, it's easy to iteratively not get there. Because I met a lot of people that told me how much velocity they had, and they sort of forgot that velocity was like speed and vector. It wasn't just going fast, it was going somewhere. A lot of those metaphors sort of came apart. So this is the term I've cooked up. I stole this from Nassim Taleb, or I at least riffed off of his idea. He talks about epistemic arrogance is the difference between what people know and what they think they know. So I like this idea of product arrogance as a measure of like what people need versus what you think they need. If you can start figuring that out, you can build less of the wrong thing, but it starts from kind of being able to say, well, iteratively or incrementally, how wrong were we? So that's sort of what I want to talk about, like how wrong are you guys ready to be? And I wrote again because I don't think any of this stuff is that wildly new. Maybe some of the techniques that we have either from the Agile or the DevOpsy sort of world have allowed us to accelerate our ability to be wrong faster, which sort of means like the difference between being wrong and being in pain is the cost or the size of it. You know, the difference between being wrong and learning is the amount of your ego or money that you sort of spend on something. So when Kent wrote this book, anybody read this book? So I always thought, if I just saw Kent the other day and I told him, I brought out the book and I told him, like, this is like the White Album, dude. Because when this book came out, there's a lot of stuff in there. Like I remember getting people to try to do continuous integration. A lot of really sharp programmer, developer types would say, we can't do that. I'm like, no, you can do that. You're just not doing it. I heard someone say, nothing's impossible, some things are expensive, which I think is a really nice reframing because it kind of says the things that we do with technology should be like meaningful investments. Maybe money is not the right term, maybe happiness or fulfillment or making people's lives are better. But it was pretty wrong. And people got into this argument, and this argument just bores the crap out of me. This is sort of like, what is an object? I can't ever have this discussion, so we're just going to eradicate that part of the discussion. So I gathered this group of geeks together, and we started coming up with language. And we sort of did like yesterday and today, and then and now, and traditional and contemporary. And this word's just a little bit too fancy for me. But I like this because I think a lot of people have traditions that are meaningful. And if you tell them they're not, and you make them change, you're not understanding their context before you start swooping in and doing something different. But even that couplet doesn't really do that much for me. These two work for me really well. Because I think if you're trying to figure out what's the least amount of process, context is still king. And are you working on something that's absolutely certain and known, or is it absolutely wild and unknown? Because if you try to apply a bunch of agile things, and you're really sort of closer to this end of the continuum, you can add noise into people's worlds by making them have a daily stand-up every day when it really it's not that significant. Now, maybe more people think what they're doing is known. So another way you can frame it is sort of construction for exploration. Or the one that was really surprising to me is I was working at the National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C., and some of the stuff they're doing is completely experimental. No one's done it. They're solving unsolved problems. The NCBI, the National Center for Biometric Information, they're solving problems that haven't been solved yet. So when we drew a continuum, they put productization on this side, which was really interesting to me because it's like, well, that's sort of known, we've solved it, now we got to make it a product that other people can consume. And I think we could say, okay, for the rest of this discussion, for the next 35 minutes, let's assume all things agile are table stakes. Whether people are doing them well or not, they're known. I'm not saying we're good at it, but they're not unknown. And let's explore what other things we could sort of do. So I did this with this group in Minneapolis I was telling you about, and we started riffing on that, like this over that language. And we used sort of the Agile Manifesto thing of like, it's not that we don't care about this, but once you have some measure of progress, this is way more meaningful. Is it something that's significant to the people that you're impacting? And impact is a word that you could sort of think about it as near-term impact. We write a little piece of that Youth for Youth Services network app, And we show it to a kid, and that kid can almost immediately find a place to sleep that night. Are the beds up to date on a minute-by-minute basis? No, they're served up once a day. But man, if you can't find a place to sleep and it's really cold, frequency of once a day is better than not at all. So that's like near-term impact. Long-term impact, the governor of my state would like to not have any homeless kids. They would like to make sure that every kid, when it's cold, has a place to sleep. So if you want to think of impact, a lot of people will talk about near-term impact as outcome, if you want, or results or whatever. But we just started flipping through a lot of these things. And I thought it was really neat because this is a group of people that by and large were developers that were pretty confident that we're going to get stuff done. And they went on to kind of say, but the more ambiguous part of the problem is, are we doing the right thing? And that's not that this is easy and this is hard, but getting the code to behave in a certain way is more discrete and deterministic than are we doing the right thing at the right time for the market and the people we're trying to impact. That's more ambiguous. That's why I think it's less obvious and maybe not as often as embraced by engineers. This is the one that I think just goes undiscussed. Because I remember when we started kind of doing sizing for these big projects and putting numbers against it, and people were like, well, that's not very accurate. Then I would watch two people walk into a room, they'd have this like 5-minute discussion, and they'd just fund $20 million projects. But our taking time sitting with the people that are doing the work and trying to have a guess at that wasn't as accurate. And I do think there's been a lot of mistakes that people in the Agile community saying, it's more accurate and it's more predictive. That's just not true. It's more measurable. But if the nature of what you're doing is non-deterministic, your process doesn't make things instantly more accurate. It just makes them more measurable so you can figure out more quickly how wrong you are. And we tossed together another pile, and I'm going to talk about this because I really like this idea. I see a lot of people getting stuff done iteratively that's not meaningful to the people. They're making choices kind of, here's 100 things, and they prioritize them 1 through 100. No one I know that's really great at product would organize their thoughts that way because it's not a subset of 1 through 100. It doesn't really make sense. That's sort of a geek way to look at prioritization. So what we did is we kind of said, what are the things that are meaningful? And we tried to put together something that we would said was prescriptive versus descriptive, or descriptive versus prescriptive. Because we were all sort of sick of people being on these stages saying, you should do this and you should do that. And so we kind of said, let's not tell people what they should do. Let's tell people what we have done. And then you can make the call of, is it something you can do? How far out is it from what you could do? Again, like 2000, asking people to do continuous integration, especially if they were using like PeopleSoft or SAP, they would just say it's impossible. It wasn't impossible, we just weren't doing it. So we had to produce enough models where people could say, yeah, you know what, that other group is doing that. Jez Humble is working for the United States government right now. And he's working on large-scale continuous integration, continuous delivery. And I said, Jez, why are you doing that, man? You could do a lot of different things. He goes, because no one can ever tell me it's impossible after this gig. I win, man. I have the model, I have the trump card. And I sort of feel like I've got to spend a little bit of time with the people at Netflix lately, trying to understand some of the ways they're working, because I think they're an amazing company. And they're doing stuff that you might not be doing, that you might not think is possible, that is more possible. And we'll talk about it in a minute. So this group, we cooked up this. We can't even tell you how many arguments we had about what to call it. I felt like we were having a discussion about exceptions in 1997 in C++. It was just sort of this bloodbath. But one of the things no one wanted was we didn't want it to be something agile. We didn't want that word in there. And we wanted it to be about the thing we were producing. And that's where the arguments sort of came from. So we stumbled on this product agility, and we cooked up a handful of these principles. So when we got lost in the mechanics, we could come back up and say, why is this meaningful? Why, if you were pitching this to me, why would I care about it? And you can see, like an example here is sort of instead of having scrum teams, we wanted to kind of create this idea of product communities. So like any good group of people, we came up with an infographic, and there was lots of arguments about that too. And the first versions were bad, like as bad as my drawing is. By the way, that's like as good as it gets. It's just live, bad whiteboard drawings, just happens to be on a tablet. But we kind of came up with this model, and there's a bunch of stuff I really like about it. And I don't think we own this. I think it's just a group of people in my city trying to say, how do we think about this differently? How do we go places where people have been clubbed by the Scrum hammer and help them kind of say, hey, it's just a process. It's not the end goal. How do we change that discussion? So this is one of the things we did. And if you saw Jeff speak this morning, you see a lot of people drawing this Venn diagram. And what I want to talk about is not just the team structure, but how do you map teams to product so that you can end up with just enough process? So if you take like a simple model and you say there's one product and there's one team. And the team down here has, Jeff probably used Marty Kagan's idea of valuable, usable, and feasible. Product, design, engineering. The only thing I don't like about usable is like, it was so fun it was usable. So it feels like it's time to maybe raise the bar there a little bit, like I liked it, you know? And this model tends to be simpler. It's easier to set up full stack teams. In my experience, these organizations, these groups, whether it's a small company or a completely independent group inside a big company, they have more autonomy. There's fewer constraints. You can sort of push the whole discovery and delivery thing right over the top of each other. And just for lack of a better discussion, like out here are the customers, and we'll call this like model 1. Sadly, that's not what I work on a lot. I work in way more complex ecosystems. So the reason we kind of ran away from the word team is it's sort of like the Scrum idea of a team is 7 plus or minus 2. You know what it was in the Roman Empire? It was 8. 2,000 years later, we came up with 7 plus or minus 2. There's got to be something sort of funny about that, right? But if there's one product, sometimes it's more than a team. It's multiple teams. So classic example I see, this is sort of how a lot of the companies I've been around in California are structured. Down here you have these service teams. And if one of these teams can produce something significant that helps you validate or invalidate your idea, boom, then you're sort of like this model. You've constrained it back to that. If you've ever seen Dave Snowden talk about Cynefin, one of the things he talks about that goes undiscussed is if you take something that's complex and you constrain it back to be something that's complicated, then while it's still difficult, it's more known. That's sort of the difference between those two. That was the way he talks about them. I think it's neat language. But typically, there's that some services team, APIs, blah, 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 whatever they're called today. And sitting on top of it is like, you know, a couple different mobile teams. So again, if you can validate someone's needs by just working this team and not worry about this boundary, that's a lot easier. But when you start having like, you know, this classic producer-consumer relationship, and to try to understand if your idea is right, you need this connectivity. Now it's the process starts to really get out of control fast. So this stuff that people are practicing at big companies called SAFe, I just see that suddenly I'm in all these teams with all these meetings and all they're doing is talking about how to do the process again. And in the background, I'm kind of thinking, well, what is it that we're producing? And they're not talking about the complexity of trying to say, hey, if we have to validate that that's a good idea to this consumer and we need these two teams together, one aspect of what SAFe does is try and synchronize the delivery of those two teams. But that's a simple concept. The more complex hidden piece is when you take the person's needs and you break it down across those teams, how do you recompose it? And how do you keep that small? And I'm not telling you exactly how to do that, but what we're doing right now is going into these organizations and kind of saying, let's not set up Scrum teams. Let's first have this discussion of product and services and see how it maps. And the other one I see all the time that sort of just makes me cringe a little bit, for better or for worse, is SAP at the bottom of the stack, like the world's slowest moving thing. Kind of evolves at a glacial rate, but it exists and it often processes finances, and then there's some kind of Java thing sitting on top of it. And again, there's some kind of a mobile, maybe like a web solution. And while it's great to have full stack teams, it's naive to think you're going to set that up. Because you're not going to get your go faster JavaScript unicorn banging ABAP code or whatever it's called in SAP. So now you have a tough constraint that you can't just wipe out. You have a producer-consumer relationship that's technology constrained. And you might be able to blow away this boundary a little bit. That might be easier to set up a full stack team there. But if you don't know some kind of idea of this mapping, and you just run around and say, team, 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 make teams great, you can do some really damaging stuff at companies by having suboptimal discrete teams being successful, but you're still not making real impact with your product because the needs cut across teams, across times. And the idea of a product owner here is like, what do they own, SAP? It's not really a product, it's not a product backlog, it's a made-up concept. The product is built by multiple teams coming together to produce some impact on customers. So that's one of the things we're doing. The other thing we're doing that we obviously didn't invent, but we sort of find that even where people are working in a real go faster way over here, Scrum, Kanban, whatever, that at the beginning there's usually some early initial discovery that's happening. And I think there's a lot of old ideology that just sticks. This idea of first we have to gather the requirements. Man, that's deep in our ethos. And you can talk to people all day long, but one of the things that I think went really wrong early on was people would say, well, it's Scrum, so we write all the stories in Sprint 0. I don't know who propagated that craziness, but it's goofy. It's arbitrary. It's like, we have this really interesting large-scale idea that's going to be worked on by 40 to 60 people. We're going to write all the stories in 2 weeks and then start sprinting. Would you guys invest in that? Doesn't that sound like a bad investment? Now, how much time should you spend is a really interesting question. Quite a while ago, I worked at a place where we said, no more than 10%. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. That company is a big, giant public company. I can't say the name. And they have a yearly conference. It's a worldwide conference, and no Agile team is going to change that conference. And the marketing people want to know what they can announce. And the engineering side is like, man, if we tell them anything, they're going to lie. So there's like that classic challenge between the two. And so we kind of said, no more than 10% of our time in this early discovery. And we weren't trying to get all the requirements. We're trying to kind of narrow the universe of all ideas. And I like this language of like narrowing and choosing. So if I go back to the nonprofit, this is me doing that work with them. So again, smaller discrete thing, fewer constraints, but still the same thing I would do at a large company. Is we're talking about why, and we're talking about who. Here's their 3 questions I told you. How much will it cost to build? How much will it cost to maintain, which was pretty sharp for a nonprofit. They sort of figured out, hey, it turns out we're not a software shop. And we've had people dump these solutions on us, then we don't know how to maintain them. And where will it be hosted? What we did is went through and explored this why space with them. And there's lots of ways you can do this. That's why the product agility thing is not necessarily descriptive saying this is how you should do it, but it's important to have that discussion. So opportunity map, lean canvas, we do this thing called collaborative framing. And one of the things we do is we sit with a group and I'll say, it's 3 to 6 months from now, what does success look like? And 3 to 6 months is arbitrary, but I'm trying to get a feel for like, is 3 months way too long? Or are they building a product that gets deployed into a hospital? Because if you ever wrote software that goes into hospitals, you can be able to deliver it every day. They're not going to take it. They can't necessarily take it. Their cycle might be, we only take something once every 6 months. Then it becomes, your biggest problem isn't can we get it done? Your biggest problem is how do we do incremental validation when the client actually won't take a version of what we're producing? Because it's not an open market product. And after we did a little bit of that, the success of the future, then we kind of made a little list of who are all the people we want to go after, and we did this really simple persona thing, but that's just one way to have that discussion. And most importantly, instead of getting lost in the process, we kind of said, in context of this thing, these 6 months, the success of 6 months, who are these people? How would you describe them? Now this is the beginning of like narrowing, because in this case, these two know people. I asked them for names and they started telling me. They could tell me stories faster than I could write them down. If we would have had some kind of uber smart whiteboard, it would have just been capturing user stories because they were telling them faster than I could talk about them. That's not always the case. A lot of big companies, the people that are building the thing don't know much about the people they're impacting. So in that situation, I don't think it's a good idea to just sprint into La La Land. Maybe the right thing to do is to take that group of people and say, let's go introduce them. Let's go meet some of these people. I used to work at a lot of insurance companies. And the programmers would always say, well, we don't ever get to see the users. And I was like, well, is anybody seeing them have one of these Go Fancy recording devices? So we started making little movies of people using the product. Instead of having a sprint demo, we sat around and watched people use the product. It wasn't ideal, but that was a way to see what people's experiences were. So if you, I'm sure they're gonna post slides, so I put in a couple of these questions. That's what I'm sort of trying to get at. What's the success of the future? And I like this language, like, who do you want to learn from? Meaning you're pretty sure they're gonna be someone that's a good target market. And who do you want to learn about? You're not really even sure about these people. The next step is sort of like what and where. And you can see now, we've taken Julie here. And Julie's the discussion vehicle down on the table. And these are just simple old school stories that are like, why is Julie trying to do what? And how are we gonna know what's successful? Carlos, what you can't see is sort of over here. And these are a set of examples. And this is a story map, just a vehicle. Because like on this dimension, we have interaction design. And on this dimension, we have complexity. So this is this little nonprofit, highly interactive, very much about understanding people's interactions with the system. This is a company called Code 42. You can imagine what a company called Code 42 is composed of. So it's like all these people in this picture are pretty hardcore engineer types. You put the same vehicles on the table. This is who, and then these are examples. And so that example thing turned out to be really strong for me because I could say, let's go from obvious to complex. And I used to say, let's start with something that's simple and do something that's harder. But that's not the right language because things that are obvious are not always simple. And I think sort of what happens with the engineering side of the house is like we have to solve the most complex thing and then the rest of it will just fall out. And it's because a lot of people have been burned by missing the most complex thing. So they go right to that and then they miss the obvious customer interactions. So what's neat about what these guys are doing here is they're saying, when she's trying to do this, and they start kind of walking through this interaction. So this is still like an interaction kind of view. And there's a simple model in here where these are human interactions, synchronous, and these are system interactions, asynchronous. I can't believe how many times I've turned a Post-it to look like a diamond, and then people think it's a flow chart. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what are we gonna do when we have a really hard problem to discuss? It's just a Post-it, I just turned it, just calm down. Yeah, but for them, that helps them kind of say, okay, if we wanna learn about her trying to do this thing, what's the first set of stories we want to do? And this is, I think, one of the big changes. It's not, let's write a bunch of stories and let's estimate them and then let's prioritize them across iterations. We use this language of like, when she's trying to accomplish this, first we do this, 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 and this, and that's what we call like a customer journey. Now, if you can learn something significant from one story, boom, that's easier. It's way less complex. But if you have to learn based on an interaction that cuts across stories, you can't just show people one story and say, what do you think? It's a little bit like giving someone a car and having them take it out for a test spin and they come back and they're all bloody because you made it go faster, but it doesn't have any brakes. They were sort of just assuming that when it went faster, there would be brakes. It's, 100% of X, some small piece that's meaningful. And I like this idea of like, where do you want to start learning? What's the most obvious customer journey? And I've had a lot of good luck with this language, obvious, because it's give me an example. No one can give you an example. That's probably sort of a tell in the first place. And what's the most obvious thing? And these are just different ways to kind of capture that. I use these kind of idea for data sciences project. I might use these just old simple story cards for infrastructure. So a little bit of discussion of that. None of us wanted to talk about planning because planning is boring or painful, or it's turned into this horrible sizing process. I had this developer once say to me, I said, what's the story point? He goes, I don't know, but if I say 5, they stop bothering me. It's like, uh-oh, what? Garbage in, garbage out, man. But so like, here's a different way to look at it. You got all your stuff. Let's say it's a sort of a scrummy thing and you have some medium-sized stories and you got some small stories and you want to learn iteratively. And I'm going to say this is a delivery cadence and this is a discovery cadence up here. A lot of people only plan based around what they think they might be able to get done, assuming that the right dimension for learning is delivery. Sometimes the right dimension is like, this thing is big and blobbish because we don't understand it. We should feed it into that cadence, whereas this thing is maybe a little bit more small and known, and we can put it in there. And if you start doing that, you stop thinking about what can I get done in iteration 1, and you start asking a little bit more interesting question of like, what's the next best investment for iteration 1? Is it really kind of taking 80% of the people that are in this product community and putting them on this discovery space? Or is it something that's pretty well known, so we should just sort of go heads down? And now we're sort of starting to turn a lot of the common agile language upside down, because it's not just learning by shipping. That's one aspect of learning. So this is the stuff we're all geeked about. I'm going to spend the last 13 minutes I have talking about it. And you can see there's not iterations in there. Because in these smaller, that simple model of like one team and one product, I think people can float back and forth between learning in this dimension, you could say outside of the code, outside of the production, versus learning in production. And what I sort of wanted to talk about is this blending discovery and delivery. And I hit it just a little bit. But so I go into a lot of ecosystems and they're sprinting along. And this is 4 or 5 and 6. And they have a little planning and a handful of stand-ups and a review and a retro. And then it's sort of rinse and repeat. But a lot of times you walk into this discussion and it's super noisy. It's not an innovative discussion of like, man, how could we manifest that idea? How could we make that user experience really great with whatever technology we have? You have someone in the discussion saying, I don't see the big picture. And that's usually a tell that you haven't given people the context you need, because they're talking about why instead of how. And so what popped up right away, this is not new, is, again, we didn't call it this, but sort of this discovery and delivery. And we use these really sad metaphors like grooming the backlog, like it's there, you just have to sweep away the dirt, which sort of dumbs down the whole discovery side, because you want to walk into this session, especially if you have a bunch of critical thinkers, with context. Who's trying to do what and why? Because the people that are doing that work, the people that are in the technology space, their gig is to understand how we can go about it. What are some of the options? Hey, if you tell me what you're trying to accomplish, I can give you more variations of how to do it. And so I started working with groups to sort of just set up some kind of a cadence. I didn't get a lot of the right people a lot of times because I had a Scrum team and I was missing the people that really had the context, that knew a lot about these people that we're going to talk to. So sometimes what we did is we would have a little discussion and then we'd go and do some customer interviews. And if it was like an IT shop, it was easier to kind of go find, maybe let's say the total population that we're going to impact is 5,000. We might be able to find a statistically significant sample set to go talk to. I love the idea of talking to customers. But if your population is 3 million and you talk to 3 people, you're a bad scientist. Especially if you say, well, the customers told us this. What if the 3 were crackpots? Then you fire up and you optimize getting the wrong thing done really fast. And all you end up with is more code. And I thought that was a good model. The other thing we started doing up here is like prototyping. Prototyping to me, I started programming in '91. Prototype meant shitty stuff that we ship and then suffer with. So I had to sort of, Rails sort of helped me with that, because at that time I was working on a lot of big C++ things. What I liked about Rails, which is mostly JavaScript in truth, is we could build things that people could interact with, that people wouldn't get that hung up on, because it didn't cost that much. It was that difference between failure and learning. We could build it. People were more likely to throw it away, but whatever horrid C++ front end we had was an act of God to like try and kind of validate user experiences. So the other thing I would say about this whole discovery cadence that I think is a mistake in sort of the agile space is there are some things that don't fit. If you sort of thought of this as like an off by one model, there's things that don't fit in one team in one sprint. There's things that like the aspect-oriented community once called cross-cutting concerns. They were talking about cross-cutting concerns in code. But my experience, user experience is cross-cutting. Concurrency is cross-cutting. Security is cross-cutting. And to overload my already bad picture, when this becomes multiple teams down here, this discovery cadence becomes the space to sort of figure out how is the work going to get split across those producer-consumer relationships when we need to more than one set of teams as part of a product community. I think that's something that's really undiscussed right now. So before I bail, I wanted to show you some of these ideas. So I said customer learning in my bad picture back here. Anybody using intercom.io in here? Or something like that? How did you guys start using it?
On the website, get it set up.
Yeah, did some geek just say, hey, we should try this thing? Yes, so I'm telling you guys to try it. It's just, some of that's what happened to my team. This guy said, oh, we should use this in-app communication. I said, what's that? Because it sort of sounded like a chat session, and like I can't hit escape fast enough when the chat sessions come up. Like, please don't ever make me do that or sign up for a rewards program. But this is a cool little model. So this is a product we built and sold to someone. This is the developer from that, Adam, and this is me right here. And this little thing pops up. And if Adam wants me to talk to me, he just parks a little note in there. And then when I log in, like on your phone, there's a little one that says, hey, I can start a conversation. And what's really cool is that, it challenges the people in this room to not railroad customers. If you're going to talk to people, you have to figure out how to not bias them into saying whatever you want them to say. That's why it's important to sort of be ready to be wrong. But Intercom, it turns out, works really well with mixed panels. Anybody using mixed panel? So you can sort of think of like, Intercom is a subjective way to kind of say, what are people saying to me? And mixed panel is a way to kind of like Google Analytics to say, are people behaving the way we want? And this is a nice little comparison because these charts often don't say we're doing the right thing, where they say we're getting stuff done. This picture right here is, are people using it the way we want? Are they signing up? Are we growing our subscriptions? Are they behaving the way we want to? That's the impact to me. And I think it's sort of time for more engineers to start embracing that the same way people embrace automation and other geekier concepts. So last couple of things I want to talk about is, I'm going to kind of just make a dumb statement and say, responsive engineering is a term I think I stole from Kent Beck. When he was frustrated with Agile one time, he was sort of upset at how watered down the word had begun. So I'm going to throw everything in there that's like XP and all the DevOps stuff, and I'm not going to say people are doing it really great, but I am going to say I think it's more known. Understanding Chef is not an exercise in ambiguity. It might be complicated, but it's not necessarily complex. What I think we need to start looking at is, how do we start getting people connected around impact? Not how do we, and I'm not saying it's not important to get people doing test-driven as a tool. This is a thing we cooked up. So impact-driven development, because it's fancy to say driven something with your titles. I'm super bad at naming stuff, so I probably didn't even pick this name, because I would have picked something more obscure and dumb. But I asked this guy, I said, before you start on a story, I want you to kind of tell me how you're going to measure the impact of it. Not can you get it done. And if you sort of think about it like a stack, if test-driven, those unit tests started, for me, telling the story of the code. I saw people talking more about the test as a way to explain the determinism of a system or a piece of code. And then acceptance tests started kind of saying, yeah, well, it's basically working the right way. This is kind of raising the bar higher to kind of say, before you start on it, how are you going to measure the impact of it? And even if you can't do it for every story, if you start doing it, you realize, I don't even understand the question, which is the right place to start. How can I say I'm going to do it right if I don't even understand what right really means from a business or a product perspective? The other thing I think is neat in this space that I'm going to let someone else mostly talk to you about is this whole chaos engineering thing. So the first chaos engineering day I got invited to was 2 years ago at Amazon. And it was New Relic, Heroku, GitHub, Google, Netflix, Amazon, someone from Los Alamos Supercomputing, and Yahoo. The Yahoo people, I thought was sort of like, oops. They did some interesting things, but Google was talking about Dirt. Netflix was talking about Chaos Monkey, and there was someone there from a company called Gremlin, but what was really inspiring is it wasn't just high geekery. The people at Netflix were kind of saying, when we run these advanced experiments in production, because they're like 30% of the world's internet traffic, so they can't create a simulation of that. They need to learn in production. They said, how do we make these changes over here to say we're producing a better customer experience? That suddenly my worlds felt like they were merging. All this idea of customer learning came together with the confidence that we're going to get stuff done. So they posted this, you can go take a look at it. And they published this book, and I dragged a bunch of copies here from my city, only to find out it's free online. But if you ask a question, I'll give you one. It might be fun to try and throw one to one of you guys if it's not too dangerous. But they cooked up these tools. So is anybody using Chaos Monkey in here? So I know that one of the people that was one of the authors, it initially came from Amazon. There was this dude called the Master of Disaster. And apparently what he would do is he would just walk into server rooms and just unplug stuff. And people would say, you can't do that, but he was alpha, and they was like, yeah, I can do that, and the problem is that you're scared that I'm doing it. Because we have a large, complex, dynamic system, and things are gonna go wrong. And so if you look at like what Chaos Monkey is, it's just a piece of code that goes out and takes out VMs because they're going to go out anyways. So the idea is sort of like if you give a human a little bit of a virus, they become immune to it. It's like vaccinating your system. But that wasn't good enough for Netflix because that was at an instance level. So they wrote this tool to do it at a request level. But that wasn't good enough because it wasn't deterministic enough. So they wrote CHAP. And I think I have the site up for CHAP. So CHAP is really cool. This is their blog around CHAP. And the thing that's cool is like that sentence at the bottom of the first paragraph. What's the smallest experiment we can run that still gives us confidence in the result? That's sort of trying to say, how do we apply simple statistics and mathematics to things and not just say, no, I feel really good about the system. You know, and they talk about this kind of, they have fun metaphors like, what's the blast radius? And so then they started doing that, and someone spun off because Netflix wasn't cool enough, and they fired up this thing called Gremlin. And their first tagline was, failure as a service, but that didn't sell well. So that was pretty funny. And now there's this chaos toolkit. So I feel like this stuff feels to me like what continuous integration felt like in 2000. This is the next step, and it's not just resiliency. There's kind of both this chaos engineering, and then there's this other side. And I'm going to let Casey from Netflix tell you about this. They have these tools, Flux and Visceral, that are like their visualization tools. Whoops. Oops. I think we have enough time to listen to a little bit of this.
So I'll give you an example. Here's an example of Flux, which is our visual analog for that at the highest level. So let me tell you what you're looking at here.
30% of the world's internet traffic in this picture.
So ignore the numbers because I made those up for this presentation. But this is a video from the actual tool aside from the numbers. What you see in the center is the internet. The three corners are regions in AWS. So upper left is US West, then US East, and then EU West. Those dots are requests coming into our control plane from the internet. So after looking at this for not too very long, your brain will automatically figure out essentially the volume of dots and what normal looks like. And the color, blue generally means the request was good. You'll see a couple red dots in there, those are errors, and orange ones, if you can make them out on that screen, are fallbacks. So they're requests that were okay, but they triggered a fallback within our system. Your brain will naturally figure out generally the relative speed of the dots, which reflects latency. So in this one view, again, after looking at it for just a few minutes, you can just glance at it and, yep, everything looks fine. You develop an intuition for the state of our entire control plane that you can access in just a glance.
This is the same thing of all requests flowing through their microservices.
For the critical path. So this is basically the critical path for customers.
So what was cool is when we did Chaos Day Twin Cities, someone from Salesforce turns out to be writing these same kind of tools if they have these large complex systems. And when I heard this, first thing I thought of is the Japanese used to have this concept of automation, which on a production line meant let the machines solve the problems that don't require intuition so the people have more bandwidth to solve the more complex problems. And I feel like they're doing the same thing at a digital level. And if you want to, you can just Google Casey's name, or I can send out a link to this. I can tweet out a link to this. But I feel like this is exciting to me because it feels like where we could go. This could be an obvious evolution now. In their world, continuous delivery, continuous integration, full automation, those are table stakes. It's not chaos because they suck at shipping stuff. They're shipping stuff that's strong, and then they're looking for either can they make it more resilient, or where are the weird signals, the strong signals that they didn't expect. So if you're geeked about these ideas, I'm totally looking for people to help us descriptively. And the Netflix people were kind enough to send me along with a handful of books and some funny chaos engineering stickers. So if you guys want one of those, because everybody sort of digs stickers. I think I didn't leave enough time for questions, so hope this is weird and interesting. Thanks very much for listening.